So hi everyone, my name is Yuki Kawakami. I'm a creative producer, educator, curator, and I recently began my PhD at Monash University in Naarm, Melbourne, as part of Past Wrong's Future Choices. For those of you new to Past Wrong Future Choices, it's a 7-year project that connects the histories of the mid-20th century internment, dispossession, and displacement of people of Japanese descent in allied countries throughout Americas and the Pacific. The project is hosted by the Centre for Asia Pacific Initiatives and Centre for Global Studies at the University of Victoria in Canada, and it's made possible through the funding from the Canadian government. And Nikkei Australia is one of the few community organisations to be a partner in this major international project. A little bit about us. We are a community organisation that was established in 2013 by a group of researchers who came together to facilitate the Civilian Internee Project, which is part of the annual Festival of International Understanding, which was held in Wiradjuri country in Cowra, New South Wales, Australia. So members include academics, creative practitioners, community cultural workers, and individuals interested in documenting Nikkei histories and stories in Australia. I myself feel very privileged to be involved in this project as a student and a member of Nikkei Australia. I really want to thank Jordan Stanger-Ross, and from the University of Victoria, Nikkei Australia members, especially Masako Fukui, Mayu Kanamori, and Elysha Rei, and also extend my thanks to my supervisor at Monash, Professor Melissa Miles, and Helen Hughes, for their support and encouragement with this first instalment of the virtual studio. I also really want to thank Rachel Iwasa, the first PWFC artist in residence, who was also part of the initial discussions when I brought up this kind of idea to Jordan. And I really hope that there will be an opportunity to see her work and how it's kind of developed since her residency at the end of last year. So why a virtual studio visit? Well, an artist studio is not just a place for production where the art making happens. It's also a place for artists to experiment and be open to trial and error, a space for ideas to flourish, but also to reflect and contemplate. It's really a critical point in an artist's practice where the vision becomes reality. And there is a lot we can learn from this process. And through this virtual tour, I really hope to inspire and foster connections between us all, and especially Nikkei artists and creative practitioners across borders. So I want to also thank Elysha for opening the doors to her studio today and sharing this unique and intimate experience with us. So thank you so much, Elysha. Just to let you know that this is really not like a formal lecture style presentation or a traditional Q&A. It's really an opportunity for us to feel like we're in the space. You know, Elysha will be leading us through her studio, and there will be opportunities for you all to ask questions. So please put your questions in the chat, and myself and Musashi Wakaki, who is a Nikkei Australia member as well, and also a writer and director, we will be facilitating the questions. We also want to advise that the research and works that Elysha will be talking about does contain themes of trauma and maybe triggering to some viewers, so please do take care. So to kick things off, Elysha, perhaps could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to become an artist?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yuki, and welcome everybody. I'd firstly like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I've been staying in Canada for the last 6 weeks or so. So the Songhees, Esquimalt and Wasanich peoples. and also pay respect to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples in Brisbane, where my home studio is based in Mianjin. I have a very unusual path as an artist. I don't think I set out to be a professional artist. I kind of fell into it by going to art school a year after high school. Took a year off and realised I didn't want to work full-time straight away, and then followed my friends to this campus in Toowoomba in regional Queensland and thought making artwork every day, all day sounded like an amazing thing to do. And I had no idea what I was going to do with my degree afterwards. In fact, I think my parents were quite concerned about that too at the time. But just started and couldn't stop, essentially. At university, I had a workshop in my final year with Chinese Australian artists who introduced the art of paper cutting to me for the first time. And since that moment, it has been something that I have independently mastered in my own time. So I would say, particularly in the last 5 years or so, so I've been practicing for about 18 years since art school, but the last 5 years have been very formative. Since a residency in Japan, an Asia-Link residency, I was in Kyushu for 6 weeks, connected with my relatives, my Japanese relatives for the first time. I visited sites of pilgrimage from my family's history, both my grandmother's occasion meeting my Australian grandfather there, and as well as our ancestors. And that point was probably the moment where I realized that this was my story and this was what I wanted to use as my inspiration and also feed into my practice as a way of sharing these histories and connecting to that identity. So it's been a bit of a journey since then. I started my PhD last year to really try and formalize that, understanding how this Nikkei Australian identity can be archived in paper cutting practice.
Thank you so much, Elysha. And, you know, it'll be really fantastic if you could kind of share with us, you know, what this kiri-e paper cutting practice involves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So kiri-e is like drawing with a knife is how I would describe it. So I take reference materials. So this is like a picture of the Japanese butterbur leaf. It's called fuki. And then I usually create a study in pen like this. So just try and simplify it down into its really simple form. And then this is what it would look like as a paper cut. So I've got black paper behind there, as you can see. And it's essentially creating like a stencil, I suppose, with positive and negative space. And I always create designs that are out of one piece of paper. So I generally don't use multiple pieces of paper, and I generally don't use adhesive as well. So part of the challenge of my paper cutting is that I create designs that have that structural integrity to keep them all together in one piece of paper as well. So I use a craft hobby blade, which is like a very, very sharp cutting tool, and it's shaped like a pencil and just cut straight into it with the template over the top and a piece of paper underneath. So I can be guided by the lines that I've drawn. So you can see that that's the back of the template there that I've drawn through.
I think, you know, what we can see there is so much precision in your work. I mean, I've definitely used a blade before and I cannot cut like that. So you mentioned before you use special tools for paper cutting, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Now I better go get them. That's something I've got to do. Just hang on 1 second. Maybe Dave would like to have a look at some of the works on the wall there.
Yeah, we can go over to the mood board spot.
Yes.
Where all of Elysha's research is. So Elysha has been collecting all of these visual archives and has been kind of bringing them into her studio and creating drawings and everything that gets her to the paper cutting stage is kind of here. And there you are.
So
Elysha's back.
Here, sorry.
No, you're good.
This is my tool. So I'll just bring the blade out for you. It's a really, really sharp blade that I put into this very ergonomic kind of handle. And I replace the blades quite regularly. So I buy them by the hundreds just to keep the lines really crisp. And yeah, so it's kind of like just drawing with a really, really sharp knife and lifting the paper out instead of marking it is how I would describe it. Yeah.
So it looks like, Elysha, you also use sort of like the transparent paper as well for your drawings or your studies?
So tracing paper is definitely a big role in my practice. So that's very sort of like analog kind of process where I might be tracing over reference images to create studies, but also I've transitioned to an iPad, which is what we're using for the Zoom at the moment, but I've invested in having like a Apple Pen and a digital iPad, so I can actually have digitally native designs from the very beginning, and that way you can actually blow them up and expand them, and I can do a lot of large scale works from printing off the designs that I've done on the iPad. So had to reluctantly transition to the digital age that way, but it has my favor, yes.
But I think also what's really interesting is, you know, I've seen your work, you know, through your Instagram page, on the website and things like that. And you have often created these kind of larger scale paper cuttings, which sometimes you wear as kind of adornments as well, right?
Oh,
so you know, what's the kind of difference in your artist practice back at home in your studio in comparison to what you've been able to create in the studios in Canada?
yeah, it's a great question, because I think I actually spent most of my first half of the residency not even in the studio. I think the beauty of having this 8-week residency, it's been the longest artist residency that I've ever been fortunate enough to experience. And with more time, it allowed me the privilege of being able to dive deep into this history and really embed myself in the community. So I've spent a lot of time meeting people, doing archival research, studying about this history and really getting an understanding, not just about Japanese Australian internment history, but that in Canada and the US, and collecting a lot of this material in terms of connections, ideas, reference images, and so forth, because you can't just walk into a studio and just start making anything, especially when you're making work that has to be connected to something that's so important like this. So yeah, I would say like the first 3 or 4 weeks or so, I was even traveling to Vancouver quite a fair bit. My first weekend was at the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby in Vancouver and understanding these histories. So that would be the difference is, yeah, this residency has allowed me to really become embedded and immersed in this community, but also with this knowledge and these stories. And then I now feel sort of vested in being able to translate these into artworks and share them. So one of the books that I picked up from the Nikkei National Museum on that first weekend is this publication called Departures, because I just wanted something that I could take away that had a really fantastic scope of the history of Japanese migration in Canada, and that included the internment years. One of the pages that I was instantly drawn to was this information about Japanese cookery and the plants that were used in internment. So it references a few different species that were transplanted from Japanese Canadian homes on the West Coast, where a majority of the population had settled, and they would actually then transplant these species with them and then replant them in internment camps and use them for particular dishes, or they would forage them from the areas surrounding the camp. So this is where Japanese butterbur was first introduced to me. So it's known by other names such as coltsfoot and fuki. There's also the fiddle leaf head and horsetail as well. And what really inspired me about this particular knowledge, just the fact that, well, the plants are actually quite interesting visually, so I wanted to start discovering them. But that sense of agency in being able to take, you know, these plants and those dishes as a connection to culture and a connection to place, I was really fascinated by that. This idea of also being uprooted and transplanted. I think there's a lot of poignant parallels, even just with that terminology as well. Hence, the investigation started to continue with that particular plant itself. So the leaf structures is what I did start to look at first. And this is the fuki flower. So the flower actually comes up first. It comes up in early spring. And it almost looks like a clump of like dandelions with leaves around it. And it's picked at a very, very young age, and it can be pickled or it can be deep fried in tempura and eaten that way. And then with the leaves, they can be really, really large in diameter, like up to like 1 meter long sort of thing. But it's the stalk of the leaves that is eaten. If it's especially prepared, it can be eaten and sauteed in different dishes and things like that. So when I was looking online to understand really what this plant looked like, you know, you hit the internet and start to look at different sites that might have photographs of this plant. And one interesting thing that kept coming up with this search was the fact that Japanese butterbur now is classed as an invasive species. So that was even more of an incredible discovery, because it suddenly put this plant in the same category as the people that planted it here. It's native to Japan, Japanese butterbur, and it was brought over by early Japanese migrants to Canada, and it was planted in people's gardens in the 20s and 30s. So it was introduced that way. And now it's thriving so well in the locations where it was originally planted. So some sites on the West Coast before people were interned, but also at the internment campsites too. So it's interesting to think now that there's descendants of these plants that represent where these sites of Japanese Canadians have been, like both on the West Coast and in the interior where the internment camps are. So I wonder if I could share, this is another root system here, I'll bring this over. So you start to see here, now I'm looking at the root system of the plant. And I think this kind of looks like a little creature when I look at it that way. But I just put the black paper behind it, so I hope you can see a little bit better. So the plant flourishes through this incredible root system, and it sprouts up the flowers and the leaves. So it doesn't even necessarily need seeds to be able to continue to thrive. So people actually took the roots of the plant with them from their gardens and planted it in internment camps. And then maybe perhaps, Jade, if we just come over here, I'll show you one of the recent works that's kind of developed from this. Oh, we've got some lovely slum too, so I hope it doesn't make it too difficult. So we've got here the fuki flower, and I've put this on the left-hand side. It's representing the west coast of Canada, where original settlement was for a majority of Japanese Canadian communities. And then it's connected by this root system, and it travels along, and in the middle here, it's got this tension, and it's purposely been torn here because I wanted to represent this tension in the paper that was also represented in the tension of being pulled in two opposite directions. So we've got the flower from this side here, and as we continue along, it ends up with the leaf on this side here. And what I didn't anticipate, but of course it makes sense, is when there's that much tension in the paper, the leaf and the flower started to warp. So it had to have extra pins to keep it to the wall. And if I just sort of stand back, you'll see it's quite a long work because I wanted to represent that distance between the West Coast and the East and the interior, because that was the point that was made about the camps themselves, is that they were so remote that in Canada, a lot of the camps, that's what kept people there, is that if they were to try and escape, they would essentially perish because it was just so far away from everything. So that probably leads me to the barbed wire, if you'd like me to talk about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of this incarceration or internment, and there's the terminology is sensitive as well because it is used differently in different contexts. So in America, it would be incarceration. In Canada, it's sometimes internment or incarceration. So different communities have ownership over different language. So it's good to be mindful about that. I came across a couple of photographs from Japanese American internment where there was literally barbed wire in the image. So I was drawn to study barbed wire in paper. And I came up with this washi paper barbed wire. So delicate. It just keeps catching on itself, but I think that's kind of makes it quite intriguing. But when you think about barbed wire as, you know, as the actual real thing, nobody wants to touch it. It repels you. It's very harsh in terms of its context as well as its use. But seeing it here in this washi paper, it's just so gentle and soft. And I just thought that was such an intriguing contrast and ambivalence just in that one study. And there's been a lot of instances of that tension coming up in the research where there's stories of joy and sorrow side by side in the same situation sometimes. So this barbed wire and the fuki plant, I wanted to design a work that brought these elements together. So with regards to a study, I would say that's like a replica of reality, like this was taken from a reference photo where there's no real sort of artistic manipulation of it. But when it came down to producing a resolved work, I wanted to create something that was completely unique. So I was inspired by the use of kamon, or Japanese family crests. So I've got my family's crest here is zaki myoga, 2 ginger flowers. And usually it's quite a circular design, black and white. So it lends itself very well to paper cutting as a design format. And maybe Jade, if you come over here, I'll show you what it's resolved into. So on the wall here, and I'll stand next to it for context, it's a lot bigger than people might think. We've got the fuki leaf. It's quite stylized now. It's been simplified. And then the fuki flower in front of it. And then encircling it is that barbed wire. And I've done it twice because I found some maps in the National Archives of Australia that were like blueprints of the camps, and there was 2, sometimes 3 barriers of fencing. So it's for that reason. And the barbed wire was also another interesting thought that came up with the oral histories, was that there were some references from the Japanese Australian community where people actually felt safer inside the internment camps because the reality outside those camps, with the harsh sentiment towards people of Japanese ancestry, meant that they actually felt protected being inside this barbed wire. So when you look at this work, I was trying to play with this idea of not only feeling like the incarceration and the internment and the entrapment of these enclosed barbed wire circles, but also that ambivalence of protection as well. So that tension, like it doesn't sit quite right. There's a discomfort in that that I think it invites people to experience.
Thanks so much, Elysha. And I think, you know, of course, seeing your work in the kind of different scales that you create your work is really interesting. But also, you know, we spoke earlier about how the Fuki plants actually look like living organisms as well. And when, you know, when you're doing your paper cutting, it is a really embodied process and a lot of emotions. And, you know, can you talk a little bit more about, you know, what you're kind of thinking and what you're kind of contemplating whilst you're making these works?
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely been very conscious of a physical and emotional embodiment with these works. So I firstly want to acknowledge that these histories of internment are not my own stories. Like my family's history with Japan and Australia began with my grandmother as a war rights in 53 onwards. However, as a Nikkei person, I think it's really important to be able to understand the breadth of all these histories in the community. And so I take that with the utmost respect and tread gently as I do deal with other families' stories in this way. And with the research that I've been doing, you know, I'm reading lots of records about, you know, really tragic sort of incidences in the camps, and even just the descriptions of some items are quite confronting. And have certainly been very aware of taking that in. But I think I've been using that energy to sort of place that into the work. I think it needs to be communicated out through the work as well. It has to be embedded within it, if that makes any sense. And in terms of the physicality, absolutely, the act of paper cutting is a physical act. So the amount of hours doing a repetitive movement like that, and sometimes when the work is really, really detailed, you have to focus for intense amount of time. And like physically, it actually manifests in like a repetitive strain injury for my arm. So it's complicated by a few other things, but it's definitely during intense periods of work like this, I'll start to get like neuropathy in my shoulder, and it'll start to creep down if I don't start treating it. So I actually have to build in massages and physio when I'm doing really intense residencies like this, because I want to invest in self-care to be able to keep going and keep doing this. So perhaps we can just, if we swing around to the works with the records that I've made, and you can see just how incredibly detailed some of them became. So like this work here, it is incredibly detailed. You can see if I just slip my hand under there, really, really tiny, tiny cuts of the stonework. And that's also resembled with the barbed wire going through there. And this just takes hours if you want to do it carefully and considered. So Jade, if you just stay there a moment, I'll just show you the reference image for this, and I'll guide you through how this came to fruition. So these works here are all made from archival images of Japanese style gardens in Australian internment camps in Loveday. So I've used photographic records from the Australian War Memorial, and I just wanted to recreate them in paper cuts because I just needed to create something and understand something about them. I didn't really know what I was doing. I just know I had to do something. When I started cutting them, I actually was using the tracing paper over the top. So I would place the paper over and try with a pen to guide and create some sort of template, simplify the image down. But I was finding it really frustrating because the tracing paper wasn't transparent enough, and also the images aren't great quality and they're black and white, and I was just really struggling to see where I was actually drawing. So I took the tracing paper away entirely and just placed the photograph over the paper and cut straight through it. So you can just imagine under here trying to find where I'm going to be cutting. So the difference in this process was that I was actually deciding where the cuts were as I was cutting it, rather than just using a guide that I'd already created, which is an interesting process into itself, because if you think about archival records, it's almost like the process of archival appraisal, where it's that decision-making process of keeping what is of value and then discarding things that cannot be kept. And by doing so, you create a narrative, just like a record does. And so even though these are images of archival records, in and of themselves, they're a record of the decisions I've made as a paper cutter of what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to cut out in the image. So it actually started with this one here, this Japanese garden. And I'll just grab the reference image to show you what that looks like. So in the original record, it's got all these plants and buildings and things in the background. So you can see I decided not to keep them in the paper cut. When I first made this work, I really wanted to exemplify the craftsmanship of the Japanese garden. You can see the stonework is definitely illuminated. The bridge is just beautifully constructed. And it also really makes obvious like how many large stones and the quantity of stones are in the landscape, and perhaps even this hillside, which is kind of lost in the photograph. This hillside is there as well. Like they would have probably had to have created and landscaped that too. And all the water as a feature in there as well. So when you look at this in the very first instance, it just looks like a beautiful Japanese style garden. And I think that's what I wanted it to be. I wanted to attract people with this work, going, oh, that's a beautiful Japanese garden, and it creates a space to invite people in. But then if they read the title or the artist statement, they understand, oh, okay, the context of that is it's in an Australian internment camp and it's made by Japanese internees. So that gently reveals itself to an audience to enable them to start to contemplate what these histories actually are. In the second work here that I created out of this series, this is the original image here. So you can see there's quite a lot of detail in the background of the trees and the buildings and so forth. So I kept them out, but I did focus quite acutely on the stonework once again. And some certain elements became really obvious that were overlooked when I first looked at the record. So the fact that this structure has beautiful decorations on the doorway and vases of flowers out the front. And I was looking down the bottom right-hand side. So here I was like, I couldn't understand what this was. And I realized it was a tap. It's a water tap. And then it actually connects to a hose that goes across the pathway here, which is a great connector for the paper cut. But also when you think about it contextually, it then makes you think about, oh, right, well, if they had a dedicated water source for these sites, then obviously there was some level of support for it. And then the fact that this structure was so meticulously crafted, it would have had a lot of labor involved in achieving that and even just gathering the materials. The lampposts were interesting because I saw the top of the lampposts quite easily in the image. They're very, very obvious. And then I was looking for the straight pole underneath to cut it, and I couldn't really find it. And that's because I realized through this act of paper cutting that it's not straight. It's a tree branch. So you can see the use of like repurposed materials. And I think it also just illustrates just how clever they were in using these kinds of ways to achieve their setting as well. And the contrast between like this very rustic structure in the background and this very neat structure in the front there. So the last work was the first one we looked at here, the Chanel, and this is a structure that was created by Japanese internees in Australia to commemorate those who had passed away in the internment camp. So the archival record description states that they would place fingernails and hair from the deceased inside this structure. And I knew that before I started cutting it, and I think that placed a heaviness while I was cutting it too. And I felt quite drawn in because I had full awareness of what the context of this image was and what the setting was. And I felt maybe weighted with the responsibility that I had to do it justice, and also share what the history and the story was about it. Yeah.
Yeah, Elysha, what I found really fascinating about your practice is that you take the viewer on this journey as you're examining the archival material as well. And, you know, it's such a strong visual language, which really reflects the like the complex and layered nature of this histories as well. So I really want to acknowledge that, yeah, I think it's such a strong practice in terms of how I think you described it as luring your audiences into your craft and then confronting them with a deeper story behind it. So yeah, I can definitely see that reflected in these works as well. So I know that you're also in the undertaking the residency to complete a commission that's part of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre to commemorate its 60th anniversary. Could you like maybe give us a little bit of a glimpse into this work as well?
So here's a sneak peek, and I suppose with me next to, you can see it, the scale is quite large, sakura blossoms. So this is almost like one half of the work, which will be installed at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre, and it'll be displayed from the 1st of May to celebrate the 60th anniversary. So the concept of this work is about the symbolism of sakura, of cherry blossom trees, symbolizing strength and resilience. And that's really what I wanted to focus on here, commemorating the Japanese Canadian community, is that despite all this hardship, there is strength and resilience that comes through that narrative as well, and to celebrate that in particular. So when the work is in its entirety, there's actually 60 fully blossomed flowers for people to find in the artwork, and each blossom represents a year for the anniversary. And when I was putting the artist statement together, I found some really fascinating history, just incidentally, about the sakura. So even pre-war, when you're talking about Imperial Japan, when the empire would have a new colony, they would plant sakura trees as a way to like make that place part of the Japanese empire. So it almost became like a national emblem. And then in terms of post-war, in Canada, a lot of these trees were brought out almost like olive branches, like a symbol of a gesture of peace. So the Tokyo government gave, I think, like 2,000 trees to Toronto to say thank you for looking after Japanese refugees during the war. Another 3,000 or so were also planted in and around Vancouver. So it's been like a gift and an exchange and the symbol of peace that's been wrapped up into it as well. But it was just so timely that while I've been here cutting them, they've all been blossoming because it's here as well. So it's been an absolute joy to walk here and walk under the blossomed trees and then come here and create the blossoms in paper cutting as well.
Yeah, amazing. So when will the work be on display? So
I'm heading to Toronto in a couple of weeks to explore it, and then I think the exhibition opens on the 1st of May, and if I'm right, it'll be up for a year. So if anyone has a chance to go and see it in that time, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly hope that I do get the opportunity to go over and see the work in the flesh. So yeah, I guess you're past the halfway point of your residency. What's next for you following this residency?
Right, so I'm coming away with a lot of ideas. So maybe if I just show you this little mud map. I've been mind mapping a lot of my thoughts down. So I want to continue investigating these ideas of using what's classed as invasive plant species as like an allegory for the way that enemy aliens were classed. Japanese people were classed as enemy aliens in allied countries. And I also have to take my hat off to Jeannie Shinozuka, who's in the audience, and I've got her brilliant book, Biotic Borders, which I'm reading at the moment, and which references this very idea in terms of the history of plants being introduced and then subsequently being turned into invasive species. When we think about things like English ivy does not seem to get the same kind of treatment as anything from an Asian country. And so I'll be definitely continuing that investigation. I've got a couple more of these archival record studies lined up, so this is ready to go, taped on a piece of paper. This is a garden in Manzanar in the United States. And I really want to continue this methodology of cutting into the record. I've been in great collaboration with some of the PWFC scholars here who have found it really intriguing as a research method to see more clearly into a record like this. So studying it with your hands in a way. So I'm interested in investigating that further. And yeah, so when I go home to Australia, I'll be taking all these ideas. I also want to thank Heather Midori Yamada, who I know is script screening in as well, because I've also got this beautiful washi paper lined up ready to use. I bought a lot of my own paper from Australia, not knowing what I would have access to, and a lot of it was a synthetic polymer, because that's what's really great for large installations like this. It's very sort of hardy, it's waterproof, it's tear-proof, which is great for installation work. But then I've been inspired by the materiality of washi and its connection to Japan as well. So I'm starting to investigate that further too.
Great. Thank you so much, Elysha. I would like to open it up to questions if anyone's got any questions for Elysha.
Thank you, Elysha. Can you hear me?
Yes, Yuriko-san, thank you.
Okay.
Yuriko-san.
Hi, how are you? Do you do any human figures? Have you ever done any?
I've done them before.
By kiri-e? Yeah.
I have done one kitty. Actually, I did a girl with a pearl earring because there was a social media trend for that earlier this year. But I haven't done it for this work. And someone did ask me the other day, like, why don't you put figures in the work? And I think it's because I don't want it to become too personalized, especially those figures are not part of like my family. I don't think I have enough ownership to put people's faces in the work if they're not from my own family. And I'm conscious of that. And also I don't want it, I want the work to be accessible to as many people as possible, in the sense that they can find something that they relate to, whether it's plant species or the garden or something like that, and that attracts them in and it intrigues them. It sparks that curiosity so that it creates that space to share these histories. So it's not a conscious decision, but I think that's probably why I haven't used any figures. Yeah.
Thank you. And also the, as you know, I'm in process of reprinting my book, and we need a design for the cover.
Yeah.
And I might approach you separately, but you know, one of those Love Day kiri-e might be very good, because you can't really reproduce the same way of the old book, the original book. So I'm after your design. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuriko-san. Lovely to hear your voice.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got a question from Andrew.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested to know the history of kiri-e. Is it a uniquely Japanese art form, or is it something that's found globally? Because I really never come across it until I started to see your works. So I'm just interested in that background.
Great question, Andrew. So it originated from China, as with the origin of paper, but it did make its way to Japan not long afterwards. So there is a history of kiri-e in Japan. It was used for things like katagami, like stencils, to do screen printing on kimono fabric, but also to screen print samurai family crests onto things like flags and so forth. So there's a lovely connection there with my family's history too. Globally, yeah, it's a very international medium historically. So it's made its way into Jewish culture. There's Mexican paper so papel picado, Norwegian and Germanic paper cuts as well. And then you think about in Europe about the silhouettes that were cut out, they were also paper cuts, silhouettes of people's profiles. So yeah, it has an incredible global history, which I absolutely adore. And there's certainly a resurgence, or maybe like a growing movement in contemporary paper cutting being accepted as a, you know, legitimately contemporary art form rather than just like a craft or folk art form as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So those big pieces, is that made, do you kind of stick pieces together, or how do you make like that really long piece that connects east and west? How do you do them?
It's still one piece of paper, and I'll show you. So this was the prototype. This is my very crude prototype, and it starts like that, and then it goes like that. So it doubles the length of the paper. So that was my very crude little mock-up. Can sort of make it, there you go, that way. So the paper that I used, and interestingly, this was new for me as well. This is the length of it here. And so it doubles that when you splice it and pull it apart from each other to represent that tension. And this is rice paper. So another sort of connection to Japan that I've been exploring about this identity of rice in Japan too. So I'm interested in seeing what else I can do with this, and also the fact that it's quite long, it lends itself to a scroll. So I might even investigate how that could play as a way to display a paper cut too.
And sorry, do you mind if I just take a photo so we can put this on social media? Is that okay? I know some people don't have their cameras on, so if you want to put your camera on, if not, it's okay. Oh, good. Anybody else want to put their camera on? Thank you. Okay. Smile. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think Sophie had your hand up.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thanks so much for showing us through all your process and your ideas. I think that would be really wonderful for students to work with as well in schools or in workshops like associated with the exhibition, particularly those ideas of looking more closely at things like the photographs that, you know, they otherwise might just sort of glance at and walk on, and then taking on that role of curator and deciding what's important in them. Are you thinking of maybe doing workshops associated with exhibitions in the future, or?
I'd love to. I mean, I've done workshops in the past, but been literally like a template. So this would transform it into something far more meaningful if there is that making process involved as well. And I think one comment that I had the other day from an in-person studio visit about those works is that it kind of made it really clear that an archive does have things missing. Sometimes we forget that when we look at a record or a collection that, you know, we think we're seeing everything, but when you look at the paper cut, it's really obvious that there's things that have been taken out. And so it makes you wonder about what might be in an archive as well.
They're great concepts for like high school students to grapple with, I think. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
I think Heather has a question. Yeah.
Hi, yes, Elysha, I'm wondering, I love this idea that you're just using a single sheet and because it falls in line with, for instance, origami, where people basically use one sheet and fold. So my question is, do you see a limit in terms of the size? And the reason I'm asking that is that there are commercially made washi papers from Japan. And actually I have some in my studio that I can let you try. And these are 7 meters long.
Oh, that'll be well, you can see here, I've got my synthetic polymers, like huge.
Sure.
Australia. So
Yeah.
maybe I kind of thought that washi was a bit limiting for me for that reason. But if there is larger scale size, then
So
yeah.
by 7 meters.
Fantastic.
And they
Yeah.
come in slightly different grades. So, you know, the texture of it is different, and the kozo quality, you know, the kozo quality is different, etc. So I'm just curious.
Oh, that would be so exciting to be able to explore that, definitely.
And my other question would be about, so imagine if you did a piece that was that large, in terms of transport, would it then have to be rolled on something?
Yeah, and that's how all my large scale work is transported. Sure. Actually, have a tube. Here's one I prepared earlier. This is what I bought my paper in.
Yes, okay, right.
Australia. Yeah, so that's the beauty of paper, I think, is that it can be transportable for that reason, if it's not framed, of course. Yeah, I've got archival paper to interleave and just roll it up really gently and send it with a reputable courier. It seems to do, yeah.
And I also just wanted to mention that in advance of your opening at the JCC in Toronto, you should really try and connect with Nancy Jacoby and make sure that she's invited, because she is the main paper person, well, almost internationally, but certainly in Canada. She's been importing washi worldwide for over 40 years.
Yeah, great. Well, I've been in touch since we caught up, so I'll send you an email. That'd be great. That's a good reminder.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Just following on the Heather's suggestion about the 7 meters washi paper, but there are different kinds of papers which has got some texture in it, and it's called shoji paper. People in Japan use washi paper onto shoji, that, you know, sliding door.
Yes.
And that has got a lot of texture, some, you know, designed paper. I don't know how you call it, but
it sounds beautiful.
Interesting trial for you.
Definitely. I've added it to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elysha, I've got a question. Have you ever considered using like shadows in your paper cutting as well? Because, like, you know, in Chinese history, shadow puppetry and like paper and leather was used to cut out people, etc. But like, I suppose like with this, have you, in general, your practice, was shadow of ever consideration part of your like medium, I suppose? Yeah.
I've definitely considered it, but I've never like committed to it, I think. Probably because I just sort of get so excited about the design and then cutting it and I'm like, oh, it's ready, you know. But I think I need to explore it because it is such a great way to expand, like scale up a piece without doing a bigger work. So you can cast huge shadows onto the wall from a very, very small piece of cutting. And so that's a really smart way to create an installation is with shadow and light. And I think there's a lot of sort of metaphorical things to explore with shadow and light and things being illuminated and so forth. It's something that I should definitely investigate further. So yeah, I'm interested in trying to do that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ellen, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I have actually a few questions. One, I know you use the paper knife. Have you ever thought of using, what do you call it, scissors? I've noticed that there are like kiri-e specific scissors. So I was just, that's one.
Yeah, I actually have a little tiny pair of kiri-e scissors that my mum gave me. They're handmade in Japan. The scissors are handmade in Japan. And I look at them like, I don't know how to really use that. Because I think with that, it's like kirigami, you have to fold and cut. And I think that's another skill altogether, is to design something when, you know, when it is folded up like that and opening it up. I've done it in terms of like kids workshops. I've adapted designs for scissors and things like that. Yeah, I suppose I'm really comfortable with this knife because you can go straight in the middle and just cut it out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have done kiri-e for my friends and stuff, so I can understand that. I was wondering, how do you sort of for instance, your sakura installation commission work? How do you put the sakura onto the paper, or like, do you put it, or like, do you trace over it, or like, because it's such a big, huge thing?
Here you go. So this is what I've got to cut. The template's taped onto the wall. So I actually cut through 2 layers. So this design I created on the computer, like using the iPad and so forth. And then I printed it in lots and lots of sheets of paper and stitched it all together to jigsaw it into one big template. And then I overlaid it and then cut through it that way. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, and I don't know, might be not a question, or maybe it's a comment, but like I'm from a place called from a prefecture from Tochigi, and they have a area called Karasuyama, which they make different kind of washi, and you can actually make your own washi, and they have different kind of exciting textures. So yeah, if you ever go to Japan,
I'd love to
try
washi. Yeah, I mean, just imagine the potential for what you put in the washi paper if you're talking about heirlooms and records and things like that, in terms of like embedding something into the material would be quite interesting to investigate too.
Yes, I've done it for like a school outing when I was young, so it was fun. Like, yeah, you can do it from at the time the Japanese have they have their milk in these paper packets, so I used to sort of tear that up with my mother and make washi at home as well.
Right.
So
yeah, I'd love to experience that in Japan though. I'll add it to the bucket list. Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elysha. A virtual round of applause for Elysha.
Thank you so much, Yuki. I know you put a lot of time into preparing for this, and it was a joy to work with you on bringing your idea to fruition. And I look forward to seeing what other artists do with the residencies as well.
Yeah, thank you. It was such a pleasure. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today as well. So yeah, I'm just going to pop into the chat. Elysha does document her practice on her Instagram. So I am going to pop Elysha's Instagram handle. And then also, if you're interested, Elysha has also written a blog post on the Nikkei Australia website. So please do check that out. And I'm sure you can follow her journey, via Nikkei Australia. So yeah, thank you so much. And have a lovely evening, day. Oh, yes.
Can we just say thank you to Jade, who's behind the camera?
Yes.
Oh, yay. Round of applause.
Thank you.
Can we see your face?
Oh gosh.
Lovely. Jade.
Thank you very much.